Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our Research Exchange talk. My name is Camille Crittenden, and I direct the Data and Democracy Initiative here at CITRIS. I'm very pleased to have you here this afternoon. I also want to welcome our web viewers. The talk today will be webcast live, so I know that we have groups watching from our other CITRIS campuses at Davis and Santa Cruz and Merced, and there may well be others sitting at home or in their offices watching as well, so we're really pleased to have you with us remotely. If you would like to ask questions during the Q&A period, there's a Twitter hashtag that you can use. We'll be looking at the Twitter feed, and we'll be happy to entertain your questions that way as well as here in person. Our I4Energy talk this week on Friday at noon is on grid integration of intermittent renewable energy resources. So I hope you'll join us for that as well. I appreciate your patience as we're trying out new ways of planning for lunch and refreshments at these events. We instituted a registration system a few weeks ago, and we're still kind of refining how that's all going to work. Starting next week, it'll be important for you to register if you want lunch. If you don't want lunch, you're still welcome to come and walk in. We would be pleased to have you. You can even bring your own lunch as long as you don't bring coffee or tea. But if you want lunch, please do register. So we'll be checking your little printed registration starting next week. I'm very happy to have Carl Haber here from the Lawrence Berkeley Lab. He's an experimental physicist and received his PhD in physics from Columbia University. He's a senior scientist in the physics division of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory here at UC. His main research focus is in the development of instrumentation and methods for detecting and measuring particles created at high-energy colliders, such as the facility at CERN near Geneva, Switzerland. Since 2002, he and his colleagues have also been involved in aspects of preservation science, applying methods of precision optical metrology and data analysis to early recorded sound restoration. He's a fellow of the American Physical Society and of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Haber.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? No? It's on. Okay, I don't know if I can do any better than this. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here this afternoon. The title of the presentation today is Illuminating the Early History of Sound Recording. That's a little bit of a pun because what I'm going to talk about is the application of optical technology to the restoration of early sound recordings. I spoke here some years ago. It's really nice to be back in this lovely building. I focused more on a lot of details of the technology that we used in that last talk. Today I want to shift a little bit towards what we've learned about actually the early history of sound recording itself from some of these studies. So I'll kind of intersperse our own technology with the history of technology. So there's really kind of three stories that run concurrently in all of this. One story is the application of IT and quantitative methods to the humanities. That's sort of the big thrust of what we're doing in our research. Another story is our own history as a culture, as represented in recorded sound, and ways in which we can use science and technology to both preserve and gain access to this history. And then the third, which is going to be my biggest focus today, is the window that we can obtain on the 19th century, which was really a heroic period of innovation and invention, when I believe you can say that the analog and the digital concepts which underlie our information-based world were first kind of explored and invented. So the pictures along the bottom here are supposed to suggest both the historical aspects. Here you see ethnographic sound recordings, presidential phone conversations, and musical heritage. Here you see some representation of the scientific and technical through these journals and reports, and then some faces you may or may not recognize from the period of invention in the 19th century. Okay, so what is that 19th century context? Well, beginning in the 1820s and then kind of ending around 1900, we see that a lot of the really key steps were taken in terms of being able to record any kind of information. In the 1820s and 30s, Niépce and Daguerre took the first photographs. This is this famous view from a window. In 1837, Morse and others developed the telegraph, and they developed a coding method for transmitting coded information. In the late 1850s to 1860, a man named Leon Scott in France built a machine called the phonautograph, which was really the first real-time sound recording system. In 1876, Bell invented the telephone, represented by this postage stamp. In 1876, Muybridge here in California figured out a way to capture motion and essentially sample real-time through a sequence of images. In 1877, Edison introduced the tinfoil phonograph, which was the first system that could both record and reproduce sound. In the 1880s, Alexander Graham Bell and Charles Sumner Tainter and others started a significant research project into audio formats and developed basically the practical audio recording systems that were the parents of everything that kind of followed from that. In 1896, Marconi made wireless transmission, and by 1900, Fleming and DeForest had introduced electrical components to amplification and rectification. So pretty much there you have it, and from there it's all been refinement. So how is sound recorded? Well, sound energy can be transferred from one material to another. It's intuitively clear, I'm sure, to everyone in this room. You can pluck a string, beat a drum. You can feel the impression of sound if you stand near a speaker. You can speak into your cup, which is plastic today. Feel the bottom vibrate. And sound can be directly recorded by capturing this mechanical effect in some way permanently in a solid. So what was Edison's invention? So in 1877, Edison was experimenting with methods to record discrete telegraph impulses onto paper discs. His idea is that if he could record on paper, he could then shoot the telegraph information at a higher speed than a person could key the button. But this led him, apparently, to the idea of recording instead the continuous impulses of the voice also in a material. So going from the dots and the dashes to something continuous. This is the sketch of the machine that he had built. A foil sheet was wrapped around a cylinder, and there was a diaphragm that would activate a stylus that would make impressions based on the sound into the foil. This is what Edison wrote. At least it's the way he wanted history to view his invention. I designed a little machine using a cylinder provided with grooves around the surface. Over this was to be placed tinfoil, which easily received and recorded the movements of the diaphragm. Croisy, who was the machinist, when he had nearly finished it, asked what it was for. I told him I was going to record talking and then have the machine talk back. He thought it absurd. However, it was finished, the foil was put on. I then shouted, "Mary had a little lamb," etc. I adjusted the reproducer, and the machine reproduced it perfectly. Okay. I was never so taken aback in my life. Everyone was astonished. I was always afraid of things that worked the first time. Okay. So this is what Edison wants us to remember. So what did it actually look like? Well, here is one of the oldest of a small number of surviving foils from that period. This one happens to be from 1878, just a few months after the invention. It's, 15 inches long and 5 inches wide. And as you can see, these lines along it are where those impressions due to the sound are located. And if we look across the grooves or along the grooves, here's actually a measurement. I won't go in until a little bit later how this measurement was made, but this actually shows you what the effect of sound in this material is. These depressions are roughly 50 microns, so kind of human hair sort of scale. And they're separated by roughly a millimeter. Just as a comparison, if we fast forward 70 years or so, 60 or 70 years, this is a disc record. Some of you may be familiar with this item. Some of you may confuse it for a black CD, but it's actually called a phonograph record. And it was obviously a commercially produced object. Millions of these things were produced over the years. And it has a groove, so it's the great-grandchild or great-great-grandchild of this. Just as a matter of comparison, instead of having this kind of very irregular-shaped vertical indentation, the groove instead was made to wiggle back and forth, side to side, kind of indicated by this little arrow. And the grooves themselves were 75, 80 microns deep, so not that different than the depths that Edison was playing with in 1878. Of course, the spacing, Edison spaced things out by about a millimeter. Instead, obviously, they got a much higher number of, say, tracks per inch. And this track density, of course, increased even further into the 1960s and 70s with the long playing record that you may be even more familiar with. So the pre-digital period of recording is dominated by these so-called mechanical or grooved carriers, and then a little bit later by the magnetic tape, magnetic formats that came into use after World War II. The earliest recordings, if we go back to the 19th century, were mostly variations on this grooved idea of Edison's, but instead they utilized a diverse set of materials and configurations, particularly through this experimental period. And these are some pictures of items that people made at one time or another in attempts to record sound. This is a thick wax coating on a heavy brass disc. This is that tin foil. This is a broken version of the reproduced disc of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. These are the wax cylinders of the 1910s and 20s. These are aluminum discs, which were popular in the years right before World War II. These are cylinders from the very early period, copper molding forms made to reproduce these cylinders. These are scratchings on paper, a very small metal ring that was used as a recording mechanism in another experimental configuration. So you can see that there was a lot of variation compared to something that when it reached this kind of commercial maturity. So fortunately, from the historical perspective, a lot of the evidence of early sound recording and the artifacts have been preserved and saved in a variety of collections. This includes a lot of the recording materials themselves, some of the machines that were used to make these recordings, and even the notes and the laboratory measurements that people did. Unfortunately, many of these early experimental carriers and equipment are, traditionally, from a traditional point of view, unplayable today. I mean, you can't. They've just been compromised too much, or the way they were made doesn't match anything that is available today. So they're kind of traditionally unplayable. They're delicate, damaged. The playback systems don't, or may never even have existed for some of the experimental forms. And as a very general thing, beyond the specifics of experimental recordings, archives want to digitally preserve all their collections, and they'd like to do that as soon as possible. Somehow they see a clock running out on old media. So this can be viewed as an opportunity for modern analysis methods to play a role. So here in Berkeley, since the early 2000s, we've been investigating a non-invasive approach to these sound recordings. So the question was, could we digitize a recording without making any contact to the media, like you do with text scanning? Obviously, that's counter to what we normally think of when playing a record. We want to put a needle down, but that brings in all kinds of problems. So if we could do that, we could address many concerns of the preservation, archive, and research community. The restoration and stabilization of delicate or damaged materials. We could think about ways to massively digitize a lot of diverse media. We could bring automation. We would have tools that allow us just to assess the condition of materials without making a commitment to playing them back. And we could play obsolete formats and legacy playback systems. And, of course, we all know that precision optical measurements are a very widely practiced technology in physics and engineering research labs. So the project that's been going on at Berkeley Lab, we call Berkeley Optical Sound Restoration Project. Basically, light reflected off a surface carries information. So we use light to create a very detailed digital image of the surface of the record. Then we analyze that image in order to calculate how a playback stylus would move rather than actually playing it with a real stylus. That motion determines the audio content, and then we can essentially extract the sound in that way. And of course, we embed this in a very modern analysis, control, and data collection framework. So as a kind of comic strip, this is the basic process. You start with a sound carrier of some sort, and you embed that in a system with precision movement, say controlled by a computer with precision stages, and then some sort of an optical probe. I'll discuss that in a moment. This probe then essentially scans the surface and creates cross-sectional images of the undulating structure of the surface. If you combine those images in the proper way, you can create a kind of large digital topography of the surface of the sound carrier. This is just a tiny little section of the surface, in this case of a cylinder. You can see the grooved structure. In this case, the groove is moving in and out or up and down in depth, but I think the structure is very clear. This surface map is something which you then just archive, and it becomes a record of a digital representation of the material. You then also pass it through an algorithm which somehow models the way in which a stylus would move, so it calculates the motion of a virtual needle. You can apply various restoration algorithms to that surface if you want to. But essentially, once you've charted the movement of the stylus, it's actually very straightforward to turn that into an audio waveform and then archive it in some kind of a sound file format. We have a number of different modes of optical measurement, and I'm not going to go into them all today because I want to really show you what we've learned about the early technology of sound recording. But the main technique that applies to these very old recordings is a form of 3D imaging based on the confocal microscope. And in this particular application, it works as follows. We take white light and pass it through a pinhole, and then focus it through a lens which has an exaggerated chromatic aberration. And that lens causes the different colors of light to come into focus at different points along the axis. So now, if you pass a surface through this loci of foci, depending upon the height of the surface, different colors will be in focus. So some of that light reflects back into a kind of conjugate pinhole and into a spectrometer, and by charting which color is coming back in focus, you essentially measure the topology of the topography of the surface. This is a commercial probe, and it has a whole variety of applications in dental inspection, quality assurance. They use them in the production of the iPhone glass screens and all sorts of other applications. But it's very well suited to this. You can measure 2,000 points a second with this system, and it actually runs almost 200 of these in parallel on a very tight grid. So it's a line scanning system that can measure a swath of data very fast, and you can program it to cover the entire surface of a cylinder or a disk quite readily. It has a vertical resolution in the range of 50 to 100 nanometers, which is very well suited to the kind of shapes and structures that characteristic of sound recording. So it's a very well-matched tool, and properly applied, you can build up detailed maps of surfaces. And we have acquired a number of these things. We've configured them into scanning systems. We have here one. We have others at the Library of Congress. We're in the process of building up other systems for a number of other institutions. So it's a technology that's been rather well exercised. Now, of course, you take this thing, you create a large amount of data, cloud of points. So in parallel, there's a very large commitment that we've made to developing software tools to analyze that data and allow us to handle it. So this is an example of one of the analysis tools that we use. So this is the front panel of a program that reads in the data set collected by such a probe. And so this picture over here is a view of the surface of a cylinder, and essentially virtually slice the cylinder open and lay it flat. Grayscale is depth. So what you're seeing here are grooves, and obviously you would this point runs down, and then it joins up with that point, and then it joins up with that point. And these kind of transitions are groups of 180 measurements that were made by one pass of the probe as it swung around the surface. This little box here relates to this frame, which is of course, the aspect ratios are very different, but you basically get a zoomed-in view of this region. You can very clearly see darker is deeper, so you can see the groove kind of coming up and down. All of this kind of yellowish-looking stuff, those are boundaries that the program has drawn around areas of, in this case, mold damage that has eaten into the surface of the wax. So you can get a lot of information about the condition of this material. You can also optionally delete these essentially from the image and then interpolate across based upon the regions that surround them. If you follow along this red line here, that's shown in this little view here, and these little sharp features are places in which this line is crossing these very sharp defect regions. If you left them in, the audio would have little click sounds whenever you cross those things. So as a restoration strategy, you can ask the program to remove them. So this is just a kind of snapshot. The tool has a lot of other features, many different filtering functions, sampling methods, and other capabilities that allow us to do the kind of things that we need to do to handle these very large data sets. Here's an example of kind of dust removal. This is a little zoomed-in region. These little white spots are dust because white is high, so they're sitting up on the surface. And you can see the program happens to rescale the intensity, by the min-max of whatever's in the image. So that's why these two images have different appearances. But if you look carefully, they're the same image, but the dust is now gone. So the application, the application of this technology is multifold. One, of course, is to transfer large or important collections kind of systematically. And to this extent, we've been doing work with the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, the University of Indiana, here the Phoebe Hearst Museum here at Berkeley, Harvard, and other institutions that have special collections or large collections, and kind of looking at ways to move these into the digital realm in a non-invasive way. Another application are special materials. Throughout the history of sound recording, there have been kind of unusual and special types of recordings that have existed for short periods of time for which playback systems are not readily available. And then, obviously, follow the timeline back through the early history of recorded sound. One of the things which you probably realize is that when you have an optical system, it's kind of like a Xerox machine. It's pretty much independent. It just takes a picture of whatever you put underneath it. So this format independence makes it a powerful tool to study the early history of sound recording, and that's where we're going to go now. So the way I decide to structure the rest of the talk is to kind of take you back from kind of the recent period, say the 1950s, back to the very beginning of sound recording, and I'm going to do it backwards in time. As a narrative, it might run better forwards in time, but I think it's also fun to go backwards, so we'll do that. So just to start off with, so I'm going to play you some examples without going into much detail because they are fairly recent. I'm going to play you some examples of different decades of sound that have been all restored using these optical tools. And then as we get into the 19th century, I'll go into more detail. So just to kind of set the scale, here's a very pristine, modern test disc that was made for us, and we scanned it with the optical tool, and this is what it sounds like.
Hey, y'all, tell everybody, Ray Charles in town. Got $1.25, and I'm just running the clown now. Don't let nobody play me cheap. I've got a 50 cents more than I am gonna keep. I'm gonna let the good time roll. Oh, baby. And I don't care if you're old. Get yourself together, let the good time roll.
Okay, so this is meant to convince you that these optical tools can play a phonograph record, at least one that's in good condition. So now I'm going to go to 1950. This is a recording by Les Paul. Some of you may be familiar with him. He was both a great musician and a great inventor. And this is a piece he wrote called Johnny, which in its stylus playback has a big scratch, and so it skips. But from an optical scanning point of view, the scratch doesn't really matter. There's no skip, there's no dynamics, and so you're not going to hear an actual skip.
Johnny is the boy for me. Always knew that he would be. But I never caught his eye. He would always pass me by. Never had a glance for me. Though I loved him from the start, and I told my eager heart, Johnny is the boy for me.
Then, if we go back to the 1940s, this is a radio broadcast that was recorded, sort of the Armed Forces radio. And the Library of Congress has a very large collection of what are called lacquer transcription discs. They were what you would have used before magnetic tape to just do an on-the-fly recording. And they're not meant to be played many times. They're delicate, but this is one of them that the Library of Congress scanned using one of our optical tools.
When the lieutenant saw several of his men wounded and fires started by Japanese shells, he dashed from his shelter. Braving the enemy fire, he brought the wounded back to cover, saving the lives of several. A sweeping order from the War Production Board tonight ends the use of iron and steel in more than 400 articles of common civilian use, and thereby puts the finishing touches on the enforced conversion of a great section of our economy. In 90 days, no more fountain pens, pie plates, cigarette lighters, toolboxes, pleasure boats, automobile accessories, streetlight poles, not even bathtubs.
Okay. So now, if I go to the 1930s, this is a recording of Iolanthe, which is actually broken. So we obviously can play a broken record optically because, again, there's no dynamics. And so to just put the piece back in its location. This is a recording made on a metal disc in 1930 by Milman Parry, who was a Berkeley-educated classicist working at Harvard at the time, who went to Yugoslavia to study essentially Slavic, South Slavic folklore. Now, if we go to the 1920s, we're here now right at the border between what's called the electrical era of sound recording and the acoustic era, where things were not recorded with any amplifiers or electrical items. So this song is called Let's Get Drunk and Truck, which I've actually been criticized for playing in public, but okay.
Lanny licked around a gang of beer. They told the corner and a word of cheer. No wonder mother told me, my dear, let's get drunk and truck. I know your other man is out of town.
Okay. Now, if we go back into the 1910s, actually getting closer to home, these are recordings made by Professor Albert Kroeber. You know Kroeber Hall, I'm sure, who was one of the early American anthropologists. He studied California Native Americans, and there's a famous story that most California school children know about Ishi, who came to live at the University of California and was extensively recorded by Kroeber and Waterman and others. So this is part of a series of some 50 cylinders that are a continuous narrative called The Wood Duck that are here at the collection of the Phoebe Hearst Museum. Right, now if we get back into the really early period, this is an example of the way in which sound recording was used essentially in a commercial kind of novelty application. This is a kind of gypsy fortune teller. You would put money in, and then the cylinder inside, which is now cracked, we were able to play it back. We'll kind of tell you what you have to look forward to.
You will soon go to a ball or large gathering and meet a new friend. A sincere friend seeks to help you in matters of importance to you. Your troubles can be avoided by changing your attitude towards them.
Okay, I think you get the picture. If we go back now another 10 years, or no, actually another almost 20 years, we get now to the late 1880s, and at this point, Edison is trying to exploit sound recording commercially, and his great idea was that children would like a doll that could speak to them. So this is the famous talking doll. It's believed to be the first recording of a woman, and the first recording made for commercial purposes. It sounds really bad. Okay, did you get Twinkle Twinkle? Okay. Yeah, so this product was a flop. Edison referred to these dolls as little monsters and had them all buried. And in the newspaper, there was an article that said that the product was a complete disaster, terrifying children and costing their parents nearly a month's pay. So it's kind of like the iPod. Okay, anyway. Now, going back a few more years into the 1880s, we come to what's called the Volta Laboratory. So in 1880, Alexander Graham Bell established the Volta Laboratory in Washington, D.C., as a center to conduct research on sound recording and other topics. He had gotten a prize called the Volta Prize from the French government. He formed an association with a chemist who happened to be his cousin, Chichester Bell, and a very talented instrument builder named Charles Sumner Tainter from Cambridge, Massachusetts. In about 5 or 7 years, they experimented with an astounding variety of materials and formats, and they produced numerous patents and eventually settled on the wax cylinder as a recording medium of choice. So the wax cylinder that you heard Ishi from and that you heard the fortune teller were essentially the derivative of what Bell and Tainter did. Fortunately, most of the experimental materials and the notes that were produced in this period are in the collection of the Smithsonian. So we've had the opportunity to work with this collection, and using our equipment in the Library of Congress, we've actually restored a number of items from this very experimental period at the Volta lab. It's really interesting. They spent a lot of time. I think they produced something like 200 or 250 different recordings, almost all different. While Edison used a stylus to both cut and replay sound from a metal foil, the Volta associates, they investigated photography, they investigated mechanical stylus cutting into wax, they investigated the use of liquid and air jets, they investigated a mechanical stylus which wrote magnetic ink and a magnetic reader, and they also basically conceived of copying and reproducing methods which would lead to a commercial process which you could consider the record industry. Okay? So it was an amazing creative burst of activity in the early 1880s. So air jets, their idea was, well, since sound is essentially pressure variations in the air, if you could force high-pressure air onto the groove, so this is the record looked on edgewise, they force high-pressure air, and as the record moves, the groove will modulate the airflow, and if you brought a little earpiece teed off, you could hear the sound. There's a whole article about this on the sympathetic vibrations of jets in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, which you can read. It's about almost 100 pages long. And here's an example of one of those discs. We played it back at the Smithsonian optically, not with an air jet, of course. And it should be the familiar soliloquy from Hamlet, to be or not to be.
To be or not to be, that is the question. What is it laid on the mind to settle the king and narrow cross on the person? What about our evidence of the cattle? And that is
to die, to sleep. Okay? In 1885, Bell and Tainter built an optical recorder, an amazing system. They brought sunlight in through a condenser, focused it onto this surface, down this tube, into this box, in which there was a glass disc covered with photographic emulsion. It was on a lead screw mechanism, so as they rotated it, the light spot would draw out a spiral path, and they were able to modulate the amount of light using sound and created this variable density optical track, which, if you're at all familiar with optical film soundtracks, is what emerged like 40 years later as sound on film, at least one version of sound on film. The method of transduction is amazing. They filled a reservoir with essentially an ink or a dye, and they spray the jet of liquid over this surface, and by screaming or yelling at this panel over here, they were able to modulate the jet, which then modulated the light. So it wouldn't be the way that I would have thought of doing it, but it actually worked. And here is the sound recorded by that method of that entire disc, which we, again, optically scanned. I broke it up because it's very hard to hear, and so I'm going to key you to what they're saying. The first, you're going to hear some inaudible stuff, but then you're going to hear the name H.G. Rogers. He was one of the people in the lab at the time. H.G. Rogers. Did you get that? H.G. Rogers. Okay. Then they're going to give the date. It's the 11th day of March, 1885. Okay. Then you're going to hear something which was a kind of trademark for them. You're going to hear a trill, which is like a brrrp sound. They did a lot of trills because it was like testing 1, 2, 3 for them. Okay. And then you're going to hear something about the plumbing, I guess. Okay. Now they're going to attempt to recite Mary Had a Little Lamb, but something goes wrong, and they abruptly end. Okay. All right. So this is actually the first evidence of actual disappointment, in history. Okay. I mean, the Bible talks about disappointment, but this is the first real evidence of disappointment that we have. Okay. It isn't actually, oh no, if you listen carefully, it's something a little worse than that. But anyway, we think that probably the pipe fell out at that point because actually it's where this dark spot is, where it clearly got overexposed. Everything stops. Okay. All right. Then they try again. You're going to hear the trill. The trill's going to be chirped because they're clearly spinning this thing up. Now they're going to say, how's that for high? Which you can research was an expression of the day, which meant, didn't I do a good job? And then the trill again, and they spun it down. Okay, now a year earlier, 1884, they tried another type of optical recorder where instead of modulating the density, they modulate the area of the beam. This is, again, very much like another version of sound on film. Here you can see a close-up of the modulated exposure. This is a much more less exciting recording. It's just the word barometer repeated over and over again. Okay. All right. Now, if we go a couple years earlier, 1881, here is probably the earliest example of a laterally cut disc record. Lateral cut is the cut that we are familiar with. It's the side-to-side undulation on a disc. This is a disc that Tainter and Bell made in 1881. It's just about this big, and we restored it, in 2001, again using these optical scanning techniques. And it's a very simple recording. It's 3 trills with some numbers in between. Okay, so again, the trill. Okay, interestingly, if you look at the notes that go with this thing, Tainter writes, our object is to use... So what they did is they made this in wax, and then they electrotyped it. So our object is to use the copper electrotype for the purpose of forming records in other substances by stamping or printing, and to use these stamped copies for reproducing the sounds originally recorded in the composition. In this way, a piece of music, for instance, can be recorded once, and any number of copies made from this original, and the music reproduced from any of the copies. So there it is. That's the idea of commercially reproduced records, which of course led to Rasputin and Amoeba, and then of course somehow consumed itself and now is an industry that's about to die, I guess. Okay, so now if we go back another couple of years, we're into the Edison era, and we have what's called the St. Louis tinfoil. It's the earliest Edison recording yet restored. It was recorded on June of 1878 as part of a public demonstration of an early commercial machine. It was part of an event which was staged by a journalist in St. Louis named Thomas Mason. The foil passed through a number of collections and was finally given to the Museum of Innovation and Science in Schenectady. It had been folded with 7 distinct creases, and so was kind of in a compromised form. This was actually the envelope that contained it with the date, 1878. The foil was unfolded in 2011 for the first time and was prepared for restoration by a conservator, kind of worked to flatten these folds a bit. Here it is in our lab. Here's the optical probe set up in a kind of Cartesian scanning arrangement. You can see a little light spot, and essentially under the control of stages, it moves back and forth, and we created a big data set. If you listen to it, there are 7 distinct sounds every time it passes those folds, obviously, because they're very distinct features. But nonetheless, the sound, just like in the photographic recording, it's mostly quite audible. It starts out with a couple of clicks when it's just passing the folds. Okay, then there's an unidentified period of about 25 seconds of trumpets or other brass instruments. This should be really the first musical recording in history. Then Mary Had a Little Lamb, of course. Okay, then some laughter. Then another popular nursery rhyme, and again, here they're clearly cranking at a different speed, so there's that chirping effect. Okay, and then some more laughter. So that kind of brings us to the end of the traditional narrative about sound recording, but actually, there's one more step in this progression, which I will conclude with. 17 years before Edison, this man, Leon Scott de Martinville, built a sound recording machine called the phonautograph, which instead of recording sound on tinfoil and therefore rendering it reproducible, recorded sound on a soot-coated paper, rendering it visible but not audible. So that's interesting. People think that's funny, but he was actually not thinking of reproducing sound. He was thinking about stenography. So his machine, the phonautograph, literally sound self-writer, he was inspired by the demonstration of photographic capture of images on paper. He said, I could capture sound on paper. He thought people would learn to read the pattern of sound, so it was a stenographic application. For some reason, though, he had the vision to actually make this a 2-track recorder. He recorded a tuning fork in coincidence with all the audio. So he actually gives you a real-time bass that you can use when you're restoring this. And we first digitized these recordings in 2008 and restored them. So the first one I'm going to play for you is the second recording in the sequence. It's just a musical scale, 1860, and it's nothing to do with Julie Andrews, but I like the picture. Okay. A couple of months before that, he recorded his first complete recording, which was the French folk song Au clair de la lune. And he wrote in the blackened paper along the edge, Au clair de la lune, the tone is measured by a tuning fork of 500 simple vibrations per second, which writes directly and simultaneously in the interlinear space. Leon Scott, 9th of April, 1860. So Au clair de la lune, you may or may not be familiar with it. This is what it sounds like, in a modern rendition. Okay, and here's how it sounded when presumably Scott sang it in 1860. And before this, there's basically just silence. So I think it'd be fun to end with a kind of what if. So sound recording in the 19th century utilizes technology and methods which could have been applied much earlier. I mean, there's nothing about chemistry or electronics or anything like that. So I always wondered, could Leonardo da Vinci, who lived between 1452 and 1519, have invented sound recording? Presumably he had all the tools at his disposal. But if you actually look at da Vinci's writings, da Vinci believed that poetry and music were inferior to sculpture and painting because, he said, hearing is less noble than sight, in that as it is born, it dies, and its death is as swift as its birth. And that's from his treatise on painting. So he thought it was not such a great thing because it was so ephemeral. It's kind of a self-defeating idea, because if he'd had access to a recording machine, he might not have, had that conclusion. So, okay. This project has had a lot of input from students. We've had, over a dozen UC Berkeley undergrads and a dozen thesis students from Switzerland come in all these different fields. Students have participated in a lot of aspects of all of this, and it's been a great opportunity to expose students in engineering and physical sciences and computer science to, a set of problems in preservation and conservation that they might not normally, have encountered in their experience. This research has been supported by all these great institutions, most of them public. Institute of Museum and Library Services, Library of Congress are big ones. And we've been collaborating with these folks, which has been a great opportunity to work with really interesting people. So today's digital technology provides a window on the entire early period of sound recording and its rich artistic, historical, and commercial legacies. And irene.lbl.gov is the project website. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Yeah. With respect to the recording that was driven by a jet stream of air,
Yes.
you have some physically altered surface. And I would say that if you play it back with a jet of air, or if you play it back with a stylus, or if you play it back with some optical means, that may actually then sound quite differently. So how much trouble did you take to actually reproduce the sound that was produced by the reflected air rather than, say, by a synthetic optical stylus that would go over the ups and downs of that surface?
Right. So in the case of the airjet recording, we essentially treated it as a, well, okay, so it was originally recorded by a cutting stylus. So our algorithm essentially reverse engineers the cutting stylus. And it did not attempt to look at sort of time response of a fluid dynamic system or anything like that. That is a model that somebody could build, for, computationally, but we didn't do that model. Yeah. And we didn't try to play it back with a real airstream either. So, I mean, these are all museum objects, and there's conservator people who are present at all times, and it's only the most non-invasive processes that they'll tolerate. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm just very curious to know how the earliest recordings of the Metropolitan Opera were made. Some of them, they're pre-war, some of them. Do you know?
Right. So there's a famous set of cylinders called the Metropolitan Opera cylinders, and they were large wax cylinders, much larger than the sort of 2-inch, which was typical of wax cylinders that you would normally see commercially. And that, as my understanding, that gave them the ability to record longer. So this is a 2-inch diameter cylinder. Yeah. The so-called opera cylinders are maybe 5 or 6 inches in diameter, and I think they would play longer. They would have been. They're in the collection of the Rodgers and Hammerstein archive in New York, and they are I mean, some of them have been played with a needle. They would have been recorded as a wax cylinder with cutting procedures, very similar to what Professor Kroeber and others did in that time.
They must have been restored by now, haven't they been?
I believe some of them have been played back. I know the audio restoration engineer at the Metropolitan Opera, and I know some of them have been played back, but many things have come to us over the years as opportunities to restore. Those haven't, but I've been aware of them since the beginning.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Okay.
What would you estimate, like, the bit depth of the early recordings? 3 bits, 2 bits, 4 bits?
Okay, so the noise floor on. I mean, there are many answers to this question depending on what we're talking about. But just say here. In fact, I may have a picture in the backup slides. Yeah, here. Okay, so the modulation on a wax cylinder, so this is very early technology, is in the kind of few up to tens of microns, okay? And the noise floor is hundreds of nanometers. So it's not many bits, right? It's few, right? That's just the limitation of what they could achieve at that time. So we actually wrote a paper which we published in the Journal of the Audio Engineering Society some years ago, where we kind of tried to tabulate these things. And you can find that on the project website.
What was the dominant source of noise at the time that created that 100 micron or nanometers sort of?
Okay, so there's basically, roughness of the material. Of course, there's the effects of time on the material. These are all acoustic recordings, so it's all mechanical roughness, how the materials yielded to the movement of the stylus, and then later attacks of decay, chemical changes, and so forth. And then, of course, damage gives you kind of discrete noise events, so scratches and the wear of additional playing. But I think you're asking about what you might call the broadband noise. That's essentially the texture of the material. Yes?
So I'll take this one last question.
Is there any evidence of, say, early sound artists that rather than just try to record their voice or something, tried to make grooves on and play it back as more abstract sounds? And when does that start?
That's an interesting question. In the 1940s, Harry Smith painted frame by frame pictures on film. So that's a kind of what you're saying, but in sound. In the 1930s, there's a case from the 1930s of somebody going in and mechanically manipulating a film soundtrack to change the sound. And that was kind of philosophically, that was a hallmark, because it opened up in people's minds this whole idea that you could actually manipulate sound. And then people built some machines in the 30s that basically could be programmed to say things. They had essentially bits of sound in them, and they could be essentially mechanical synthesizers. That's sort of the 30s was sort of the earliest that I've come across in terms of any of that. But there may have been others. And the reason I was kind of amused by the question is that we're in the process of organizing a project to build a system like this for the Moscow Conservatory of Music, which has a big sound collection. And so they came over, a bunch of them, a couple weeks ago, and there was an artist in the group, and she was very interested in whether it would be possible to, do exactly what you said, take a cylinder and cover it in clay and create little drawings and see what they would sound like. I think they'll sound kind of noisy, but there have been people in modern time who've sonified landscapes and.
More back in around 1910, 20.
I haven't come across that. They probably didn't publicize it in those days. They get run out of town. Other questions?
Thank you.
I'm happy to take them offline.